We're live.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. We'll get started in just a few minutes. We'll give everyone a chance to enter the room. Can everyone hear me? And oh, sorry. Anissa, can you let me share my screen?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. There you go.
Thank you. Welcome everyone. I think we'll wait just a couple more minutes and then we'll get started. Okay, it is 7:02. I think we will go ahead and get started. And thank you all for joining us this evening to celebrate Matthew Clark Davison's debut novel, Doubting Thomas. I'm Kevin. I'm a librarian from the Hormel LGBTQIA Center at the main library, and I am excited to be here to introduce our guests. And before I do that, I will start us off with a land acknowledgement and a few brief library updates. And please check the chat box for all the links that you'll need covering everything that I'm mentioning in my intro. And we will start with a land acknowledgement. The San Francisco Public Library acknowledges that we occupy the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of the San Francisco Peninsula. We recognize that the Ramaytush Ohlone understand the interconnectedness of all things and have maintained harmony with nature for millennia. We honor the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples for their enduring commitment to Wawrep, Mother Earth. As the indigenous protectors of this land and in accordance with their traditions, the Ramaytush Ohlone have never ceded, lost, nor forgotten their responsibilities as the caretakers of this place, as well as for all peoples who reside in their traditional territory. We recognize that we benefit from living and working on their traditional homeland. As uninvited guests, we affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples and wish to pay our respects to the ancestors, elders, and relatives of the Ramaytush community. We recognize to respectfully honor Ramaytush peoples, we must embrace and collaborate meaningfully to record Indigenous knowledge in how we care for San Francisco and all its peoples. And I would just like to tell you briefly about the James C. Hormel LGBTQIA Center. It consists of the reading room you see on the slide, as well as archival collections held on the 6th floor in the SF History Center. We have approximately 10,000 books and 200 archival collections, as well as videos, magazines, newspapers, journals, and more by and about LGBTQIA people, with a special emphasis on the San Francisco Bay Area. And just to let you know about a couple of events coming up on October 12th at 7 p.m., Thomas Moniz and Michelle Gonzalez will be in conversation in person in the Latinx community room at the main library. and that event will also be live streamed. And the next event hosted by the Hormel LGBTQIA Center is on October 20th. And that is a panel discussion, queer writing on growing up with the AIDS crisis, with editor Matilda Bernstein Sycamore alongside 4 of the contributors to the anthology. And we'd like to thank Fabulosa Books, formerly known as Dog-Eared Books Castro, for co-sponsoring tonight's event. You can buy the book from them in person or online, and we will put the link in the chat for that. And I am now ready to introduce our guests. Matthew Clark Davison is creator and teacher of The Lab, writing classes with MCD, a non-academic school started in 2007 in a friend's living room. The textbook version of The Lab, co-authored by best-selling writer Alice LaPlante, will be published by W.W. Norton in 2022. His prose has been recently anthologized in Empty the Pews and 580 Split, and published in or on LitHub, Lambda Literary, The Advocate, Guernica, The Atlantic Monthly, The Rumpus, Foglifter, Exquisite, Pandemic, and others. Matthew earned a BA and MFA in creative writing from San Francisco State University, where he now teaches full-time in the BA, MFA departments. Doubting Thomas is his debut novel, and it was published this year by Amble Press. Michael Nava is the author of an acclaimed series of 8 novels featuring gay Latino criminal defense lawyer Henry Rios, who the New Yorker called a detective unlike any previous protagonist in American noir. The New York Times Book Review has called Nava one of our best writers. He is the recipient of 7 Lambda Literary Awards in the Gay Mystery category and the Bill Whitehead Award for Lifetime Achievement in LGBT Literature. His most recent Rios novel is Lies with Man, which was published in April by Amble Press, an LGBTQ press and imprint of Bywater Books, of which he is also managing editor. Okay, and it's my pleasure to turn it over to Michael and Matthew.
Thank you, Kevin and Anissa, and thank you, the San Francisco Public Library, for hosting this event. I am a library user, and I hope all of you are too. So I'm Michael Nava, and as Kevin said, I'm the managing editor of Amble Press, and I'm here with Matthew Clark Davison to talk about his debut novel, Doubting Thomas. Matthew's book was the first book I acquired as managing editor, and it's a book of which I'm extremely proud. And I met Matthew through a mutual friend of ours, John Trout, who had taken Matthew's, who studied with Matthew at the Lab and was a close friend of mine. And I just wanted to acknowledge that because I see his sister Mary is here. So hi, Mary.
Hi, Mary. Good to see you.
We will be talking, we will talk about Matthew's background as a teacher and a writer more extensively in our conversation. I'm going to skip the introduction since Kevin did such a great job doing that. But I do want to briefly introduce the novel, which again, we'll talk about in greater detail in a moment. So Thomas McGurrin, the protagonist of Doubting Thomas, is a 4th grade teacher and an openly gay man at a private primary school serving Portland, Oregon's wealthy progressive elite, when he's falsely accused of inappropriately touching one of his male students. The accusation comes just as Thomas is being thrust back into the center of his unusual family by his younger brother's battle with cancer. Although cleared of the accusation, Thomas is forced to resign from a job he loves during a potentially life-changing family drama. You know, I can't begin to cite the many, many glowing reviews and endorsements Matthew's novel has generated since its publication in June, but I want to quote the closing paragraph of the review in our hometown paper, the San Francisco Chronicle. Quote, "Thanks to the care Davison pays to his characters, each one a fully realized thinking human in Thomas's orbit, what could be an overserving of tragedy is instead delivered with clarity and nuance. The result is a novel that manages to take on a number of the world's traumas without ever being swallowed whole. Instead, using the personal travails of a gay man at the dusk of Obama's America to probe at the nature of what it truly means to know oneself. That's the kind of review that most writers would give their right arm to have and would probably inscribe on their gravestone. So congratulations, Matthew. But
I was very pleased.
before we get to the novel, I want to actually start with your personal story. So you were a teenage runaway. How did you get from there to here?
Well, maybe I have some things in common with a cat in that maybe I have 9 lives. I don't know. It's so crazy for me to think about that, especially when I think about my nieces and being 15 and leaving home. And I really was completely financially independent from that time until now. And I can't believe it sometimes. I was super lucky. I had a lot of incredible support along the way. My mom and I kept in touch the entire time after I left home. And she also helped me by the time I got to California when I was 17. My family had moved from Massachusetts to from California to Massachusetts, like Thomas's family. And by the time I got back to California when I was 17, my mom had worked at El Camino Hospital in San Jose, and she had a nurse acquaintance that had bought a condo that she couldn't quite afford and needed to rent out the second bedroom. So it was kind of like runaway with tethers to my mom still, but it was still 3,000 miles away from anyone I was related to.
So what precipitated your leaving home?
I was just asked this on this podcast that I recorded yesterday, and it took me by complete surprise, and I choked up and started crying. So I hope that I'll do a better job maintaining composure this time. I think that a lot of people assumed that I left home because I lived in a place that was extremely hostile towards gay kids. I was really feminine as a kid. And that's the train at Jack London Square that you'll be hearing periodically. And so, was I bullied and did I have that kind of those gay tropes? Yes. But I think that what I discovered was that my father, around his work acquaintances and friends, and my older brother around his friends, were ashamed of me. And I don't think that either one of them wanted to be ashamed of me, but I think that they struggled because of what the context in where we were living. And I loved my younger brother so much, and he turned 10, and I started to see him growing up and interacting with people in ways that made me fear that he might one day be ashamed of me too. Mm. And I didn't feel like I could handle it. Plus, I had dropped out of high school. My parents were married and separated, and he was coming back, and I wasn't very good at taking orders, especially not from him at the time. We're good friends now, but at the time, I wasn't good at taking orders.
So, when did you come out as a writer? Was there a single precipitating event, or is it something you discovered about yourself over a period of time?
There was an event. I wanted to be an actor. I think that I thought that I could do something on stage. And in fact, some of the reasons why I'm a writer now were probably because I was lucky enough to see The Normal Heart by Larry Kramer and Bent by Martin Sherman. And then, of course, on a bad date where I didn't know where I was going, I went to go see the first part of the world premiere of Angels in America. Wow. The date was really bad, but the show was really good. And so I thought, those were the kinds of plays that I wanted to be acting in, things that I thought would, I didn't know the terminology at the time, but I did believe in catharsis, like audiences could be changed by witnessing something that was compressed and dramatic. And so I wanted to be a part of that, but I was so self-conscious from probably the stuff that happened to me when I was a kid that I couldn't quite be free in my body on a stage. But I did write my own monologues, and the casting directors would ask me who wrote them. So that I took a hint from that, but it was really June Jordan and the recently passed away Janice Mirakatani, San Francisco legend at Glide Church, who invited me to participate in Poetry for the People in the basement of Glide Church, and sort of an offshoot, a community offshoot from the legend June Jordan's famous UC Berkeley class. And it was really there that, Jan told me that I was a writer. And when Jan Mirakatani said something to you, you it was, whether you agreed or not, you just went with it.
Yeah. Well, that's very interesting, because I think a lot of us needed that permission to be writers. I know for me, coming from a working class Mexican-American family, the first person to go to college, the idea of a life in the arts was unimaginable until my mentor, Ruth Barton, who was a Yeats scholar, told me, you're a writer. And that was a permission I needed, really, to pursue what seemed like an unreachable dream. So were you always going to write about the experience of being queer?
Yes, because yes, because I'm, gay von Gatesburg times 20,000. I don't think I could have written about anything else, but
yeah, you're pretty dyed in the wool, Matthew.
Yeah, exactly. Thank you. But really, it was my my best friend Chuck, who was like a mother figure to me, that I met at California Cafe at Valley Fair, where I got my first California waiter job shortly before I moved to San Francisco. I think that was 1987. Chuck was like my mom. He told me what to do. He told me what to wear. He told me what not to wear. He told me how to get in the club. He told me what to wear to the club. He was from North Carolina, from Raleigh, and he had an accent. I can still hear it in my mind as clear as day today. And he was 30 years old when he died. He was, I have pictures of us together out on Halloween, where his mixture of like painkillers and booze and other medications that he was on, it was a crapshoot. You never knew what you were going to get. But he died, and when he was 30, and I watched that happen along with his lover and this small group of people. And then shortly after that, my best friend, because he wouldn't marry me, I was in love with him, but he just wanted to be my friend. He got diagnosed, and then 2 years later died. And so really, I was less interested in telling my story, even though I had a dramatic one in some ways, and more interested in preserving their memory.
So, was there ever a moment when you were pursuing your MFA, for example, that some well-meaning straight person told you might be more successful if you tone down the gay stuff?
Well, I had some interesting things. Stacy, who's here, was in some classes with me, and he was there. Stacy, I don't know if you remember this, but there was this one class where I had written this scene. I wrote about this guy named Alex, who was like a teenage runaway like me. It was pretty autobiographical about my trip cross country when I was very young. And I looked kind of like a cross between Boy George and Madonna at the time. And I rode 5 days by myself in a Renault Alliance across country. And it was a project that I was working on called Roadmap. And I brought in this scene, and Alex had sex with this guy, and Brian, who was in our class, referred to them as like the boy and the girl, or the man and the woman, these two guys. And so, stuff like that happened. But believe it or not, that actually wasn't problematic for me, because he had read my story so carefully, and he didn't want me to change anything. He just wanted me to get clearer. And when I kind of talked to him about it afterwards, after class, he was just like, well, you made them Alex and Adam, which is something that if you've read the book or you looked at it, I have a problem in which I name all of my characters like the same first letter and the same number of syllables. But the implicit messages were really the ones about like, I felt like I was sending out my work, and I did have some really good luck early on. But with novels, I literally have a hard copy of a rejection letter that said, we've published one gay book this year. We've published a gay book this year. We loved your book, but we have to pass because we published a gay book this year. And so all of those things like really did kind of add up. And I think they did make me second guess. I felt sometimes like I might not have been gay enough for the gay presses and not straight enough for the straight presses.
Yeah. And I know that with Danny Thomas, you had some, experiences that were along those lines, which maybe we'll come back to in a minute. But I mean, so it's one thing to decide to become a writer, which is in and of itself an enormous step. But then you are also a teacher of creative writing. And how did that happen?
I remember exactly the moment it happened. And also, Michael, I want to just go back to something that you said earlier. Me too. It was like you and I both. I don't come from a Mexican American family, but I come from an Irish mixed American family, and both of my grandmothers had extremely challenging circumstances. My paternal grandmother was a single mom during and after the Depression, and then also grew up during the Depression, and then was a single mom. She was pregnant before she was married, as was my maternal grandmother, and both of them, my parents weren't able to go to college. My mother did get to go to nursing school, and then later got some degrees. But when she was in her 40s, but the thought of like studying creative writing, I didn't know what an MFA was my senior graduating year of my bachelor's degree. And the only reason why I got a bachelor's degree is because, once again, Jan told me to. Jan Miracatani really took me under her wing, and she told me to go back to her alma mater, San Francisco State, which is one of the places she studied. She actually went to UCLA. But back to that question, I couldn't conceive myself at all going to graduate school until I got there. I never even thought that a person like me could be a teacher in a classroom. And then Bridget Mullins, the wonderful queer playwright, one day she was teaching a class on, I don't remember if it was on James Joyce altogether or if it was just on the short story or whatever it was, but we were talking about the dead that day, and I had read it and I was really impressed. And she came walking into the classroom, and she had a bag, and she put it on the desk while reciting from the dead by memory. She took out a shoebox, changed her one pump on one foot, put it on the desk, and put the new one on that foot, and then the same thing, uninterrupted reciting James Joyce, and then afterwards said, "The shoe sale at Nordstrom is cheaper than therapy." And in that moment, I knew I could be a teacher too. So that's when I decided that I would go for it.
But it requires a different aptitude, teaching and writing. You discovered that you had the aptitude for teaching, for communicating ideas of craft to students, for being receptive and encouraging and inspiring them. I mean, that's a very different thing than sitting in a room and making up stories with no one around.
When I took the GRE, which again, I didn't know what that was, but back then you had to take this test to get into to go to a creative writing program. I had a perfect score on the logic part, and I didn't even know I had that aptitude. I thought that I was going to score much higher on the English. I scored lower than I expected to, and my math was the disaster that we all expected. Sure. But the the logic was. And I think that my mind has always been able to, I think it's partially how it was that I was able to feed myself and even have, like occasionally like a cashmere sweater or whatever. It was like, I was good at looking at a system and figuring out what its component parts were. Mm-hmm. And then my brain is able to process and chart trends. So if I read 100 stories, then somewhere in my brain, it stores what they have in common. Mm-hmm. And so those things get me super excited. I love creative problem solving. I love puzzles. And that's what I think kind of a story, a novel, a play really is. So but I don't know whether or not I stand up. I mean, some students are here in the room, Paris and Kirsten and Ashley, I think. But they would have a better way of telling you. I don't quite think that I stand up there and tell people what a short story or a novel is. I think more I share my excitement for works that I think are really passionate, and then start asking questions to the group, like, what are you noticing? What are you noticing? And then we talk about like maybe what some of those strategies were, and then and then start to try to define what each of our individual take on that strategy might be for our own project.
Well, it's interesting, because I thought I of course was a lawyer for many years, and I found that legal training was actually really good for fiction because, as I've said, a novel is like a legal brief. It's an argument. You're trying to persuade the reader that though the reader knows these people never existed and these situations never occurred, nonetheless, you tell it so compellingly in such a logical order that they're willing to, suspend their disbelief and to enter into it. So there are many ways to approach writing. I want to come back to your teaching, but we need to talk about the book. So, so at the beginning of the book, it seemed to me that Thomas was in flight from his gayness, or at least in a kind of semi-closet, though he didn't, deny that he was gay. And what led this otherwise very intelligent and capable person to make that choice, to conceal that part of himself?
Yeah, well, of course, for me as a writer and a writer of fiction, there is no fantasy that's further away from my reality than someone who can pass as straight. So I was sort of fascinated by. I really rebelled. I still have an anchor streak in me that is dangerous. I react to situations emotionally and passionately. It takes a lot of restraint for me when I'm emotionally agitated not to act out. I feel like maybe I've gotten to like a 17-year-old's level of maturity around this, and I'm 51. So I was, of course, just wondering what it would be like. James Cameron Mitchell in his project, Anthem Homunculus, talks about that character in that incredible, it's a kooky, incredible, smart, amazing podcast thingy. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's like a musical podcast, audio drama. And he talked about it in interviews, and he said it's like what he imagined himself, how he would be had he not left his small town. And I kind of wondered like what my life might have been like had I been able, because I tried and failed to pass because I wanted the blood inside my body. I wanted friends. I wanted to be appreciated for my capacities, for my intelligence, for my humor. And in the town that my parents moved to, it is not an exaggeration. There are witnesses that I could not move my body through space and time without people negatively commenting on it. That was in my home, it was in my church, it was in my neighborhood, and it was at my school, and it was relentless. And so for me to think like, well, I tried so hard, I put on the outfit, and you should have seen me trying to wear that plaid shirt and the Wranglers and the Timberland boots. I looked like a polar bear in a bikini. And, I tried to butch it up, and my mom called me snake hips. And I said, snakes don't have hips. And she said, exactly. Watching me walk. And so I think that, I think that Tom was really haunted by the character who was more like me in the book, and that's Chad. Mm-hmm. And he was really haunted that he saw himself in Chad and he admired something about Chad, but he wanted his blood on the inside of his body. And he also loved his brother and wanted to be like him because he admired him. So I don't think of Tom as being like closeted and I think like many gay men, he also struggled to relate to other gay men. He was more heterosocial, meaning that his deeper relationships had always been with women. And so I think that he did this whole theoretical thing in college where he was in grad school where he decided, I'm going to do my thesis on the importance of being an out teacher. But then he got into public school and he heard people like bringing their kids to school going, you know, talking about faggots and this and that, like real stuff that I heard right around the same time that the book is taking place. I was working for a nonprofit and visiting schools in the San Francisco school district. And I would hear parents using words like, you need to be a little man, you need to stop crying like a faggot in 2013 in San Francisco with full voice on the street outside of the public school. So I don't really judge Thomas for that thing. I was scared in those situations sometimes. I was also scared that they might, I was always standing 5 feet. I was in observational role. And so I was always standing far away from the kids because I understand the conflation in the society of queer people and out queer people and child molesters.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting. I mean, it's almost a cliche to say that queer people are born behind enemy lines in a way that's unique to us. People of color are born within communities of color, but we are born within straight communities. And I think I said, those of us who can't disguise ourselves, who can't pass, have a much harder time of it, but then have the impetus to escape it. While those of us who can sort of pass really struggle with where our allegiances lie. And in some ways, it's more difficult for someone like Thomas really to claim his otherness, to claim his difference, and to really engage with it, because the pool of conformity and the rewards of conformity are so great.
Yeah, I have a couple of lesbian, literally one is maybe even here. I don't know if I have the permission to out them, but somebody who really super identifies queer, but is in a heteronormative seeming relationship to the outside world. And, they might even call themselves a word like, fag or dyke in a loving, self-loving way to reclaim that word. And yet they might have all of the privileges that come with being seen as heterosexual in society. And I have another friend who's not here tonight, but who said to me, like after years and years and years of putting up with, and had fairly tolerant family members and everything, but she accidentally fell in love with a dude and married him. And she was just like, Matthew, I still consider myself as much of a lesbian today as I did before I met my husband. But I got to say, the way that I'm treated in an airport, in a hotel, in a restaurant, it's so much nicer. She's like, I'm ashamed to say it, but it is true. And I don't mix up what it is to be a person of color with what it is to be a white cisgender gay man in this culture. But I did think that during the Obama administration, with gay marriage becoming legal, that the ways in which liberal America was seeing President Obama's skin tone being a reflection of the fact that we're beyond racism in the culture, and the fact that gay marriage was becoming legal in a few states, or that there were characters on sitcoms that were gay characters, that we were beyond homophobia as a culture. And that made me super, super nervous. And I did feel like there were people in my life who found those things in the same bucket, homophobia and racism, and they were part of the same thing. And there were people in my life that thought that they were in really separate containers and need to be talked about distinctly. And those people are my family, both chosen and biological. Do you know what I mean? Like through marriage and through, in my friendship circle, those conversations were swirling around all over the place during that time. And also having lived through the AIDS years and the Reagan administration, I just don't trust government or bureaucracies. And so I was really, really nervous about this pendulum swinging the other way. So I thought that within Thomas's family, that those things that you just described, that would be including like just sort of shame around addiction and whatever else, in the ways in which some people, I felt like those were great opportunities.
Well, I mean, so that actually leads me to my next question, which is an important aspect of the book is of Thomas's story is showing us just how provisional acceptance of LGBTQ people is, even by our so-called straight allies. Because in the book, you know, these liberal, wealthy Portlanders are quite quick to turn against him when the whiff of pedophilia is released into the air. So does this reflect something in your own experience as a gay man, or something you've observed?
Yeah, but again, I think that yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, I do think that what happens at Country Day is more of a revelation about humanity. I think that sometimes, like, I've spent a lot of time in New York, and I've been exposed to gay people with a lot of wealth and also a lot of access to education. And you know, we create hierarchies everywhere. It just seems like what human beings are busy doing all the time. And I feel like what happened there, well, yes, it was tinged by like the homophobia that exists in the culture. I felt like I asked myself, if somebody had been accused of touching a child inappropriately, and I just want to go on record as saying that what Toby J, that kid, says is true. The kid has not lied. The kid said, Thomas touched my pants. And it's explained in the novel what exactly happened. And in a room full of witnesses, it was where it went in the parents' imaginations. But once that gets into the larger imagination of that sort of bubble that they created with Country Day, could I, as a parent, spending that amount of money on that school, still have sent my kid? Because there's a gay couple that takes their kid out of the class too.
Right.
And I couldn't 100% say for certain that I wouldn't have been one of them. So it's less me trying to point my finger at like the failure of allies, and more my wanting to explore at what point do human beings fail to continue to be each other's keepers, their siblings' keepers.
Yeah, although I mean, I have to say, you know, the notion of pedophilia and being sexual predators, it is such a deeply seated part of the machinery of homophobia that you know, I mean, would a straight teacher accused of inappropriately touching a female student have been subjected to the same level of scrutiny? I don't know. I mean, would he have been given a chance to explain himself in a way that Thomas wasn't?
Some of the straight guys that have read the book and that have interviewed me have expressed their own anxieties around how quickly an accusation can turn into a conclusion. Mm-hmm. And I think that their anxieties around cancel culture have come up in conversations and such. And I actually feel a little bit differently than some of the stuff that I've heard expressed. To me, what I was really most interested in was the toll that takes on a person's inner life. Mm-hmm. When you're an uncle, when you're a friend of people that have children, when I feel like anytime human beings attempt to create a utopia and something messes it up in any way, they are going to rid the messiness. It's the easiest way to get it done, is just to get rid of it. Yeah. And so I feel like this idea that these children, this school is based on a school in Portland that I visited with my best friend, and it didn't happen there. And so I of course changed the name and what have you. But I was just thinking, like, you know, there are people that think that this country is a meritocracy, And I was looking at this place. These kids literally can choose at this school between Mandarin and Cantonese. You do know what I mean? And then there's Japanese, and then there's robotics, and then there's, there's these programs that are just like, and the actual atmosphere, it's like, it's so far ahead of what the average person gets. And it's just, it is incredible. And like, so anything that tarnishes that has got to be expurged. So I don't know how, like, I do think that disasters can happen to anybody accused of something. But I was really interested in, like, how Thomas's entire life, that this thing was just the pin that popped out and made him have to re-examine his whole life.
Well, yeah, I mean, yeah, it's not really, yeah. I understand the point you're making. That it's really about Thomas and the effect internally on his personal relationships, rather than how this thing snowballs from accusation to fact. But just, and I want to ask you about Thomas and the family, especially his brothers. But just in passing, I would say it's true that utopias are always, first of all, utopias are impossible, and the notion of expunging or purging a place of its defects or defective people, the problem with that is, it leads to genocide.
It's bad news. It's bad news. We need to learn how to, like, communicate. Yeah.
Reconciliation, not purgation. Anyway, so one of the most, I think, gripping scenes in the book is when Thomas's older brother turns to him and says, "Did you do it?" Because of what that reveals about the relationship between Thomas and that brother. And I know that you and I have talked about this, for a year now, that this is a book about brothers. And I wanted to give you a platform to talk about why that was important for you and about the relationship of those three brothers.
Yeah, I do feel like when I talk about this system, I mean, I don't know what I'm talking about. Patriarchy, capitalism. I heard somebody really smart talk about, I think it was Tao Lin on Other People podcast with Brad Listy, talking about, there's a name for it. It's just like a synonym. It's a non-gender specific synonym for dominator society, I think is what he called it. And he was quoting some other really smart writer. So sorry, I don't have the goods on that right now, but I think that whatever it was, my brothers and I always loved each other. And sadly, the system, whether it was coming from the Catholic Church or coming from the town values where we lived, or fear, it destroyed our opportunity to know one another. And it wasn't until my older brother had his first kid that we had an opportunity to start to get to know one another. And so my brothers and I became friends later in life. And I was always haunted. My first novel I wrote in grad school was about a only child, because I didn't have the emotional maturity or the skills in order to deal with how overwhelming those emotions were for me, that I essentially left home when my younger brother was 10 years old and had barely any contact with him again. And so when I read Justin Torres's novel, We the Animals, it brought up a lot of memories for me about what it was like to just be like wild, feral boys with a kid. I didn't think of myself as a boy. I was probably, as a child, gender nonconforming, or I don't know if I thought of myself as a girl, but I definitely thought that my brothers and dad were a part of a group that I was not a part of, and that maybe me and my mom were the other group. And my mom was kind of butch in a cute way. So
you were a lesbian.
We sort of met each other halfway. And anyway, I was haunted by that. And I'm sad that the society that I grew up in, including I'm very proud of my working class background, but that town had such a hardcore way of, I think of myself as a worker more than I even think of myself as a writer or a teacher. Um, and I think that something about that kind of pulled the rug out from underneath us. And I have wondered who we would all be to each other had we had those years. And so I explored that with James and Jake and Thomas. And they're very different than my own brothers in almost every way, because my brothers are kind of too sweet and drama-free in many ways to earn a place in a novel. So I layered and layered and layered them with some of my own problems, and also made them composites of a lot of different relationships in my life. And that moment, I do think it fits with James' sort of more fumbling, like Tourette's, like, oh, my gay brother, like, let me shout about it at the airport, sort of way to be perceived by others as like down or cool or woke, without really considering the consequences. But he's earnest, like he's trying to be in relationship and have intimacy.
But he doesn't really have to consider the consequences in a way because he's not gay. So,
Yeah, no, he's in fact very sheltered.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Jake is the younger brother. Yes.
Jake is the younger brother. Yes.
A very complicated, I mean, very gentle and sensitive man who's straight, which is, that hardens men in a different way than if they're gentle and sensitive and gay, I think. And I think you portray that really well.
Thanks. I only just realized this. I mean, I've read the book many times, and I only just realized in having a conversation with somebody else about the book that that Thomas made a mistake in his conclusions about Jake and Cherie. He always thought that they were saying, oh, we're addicts, and so we're defective, and so we're like you, and so we're us. And Thomas was always like, my gayness is not the same as your addictions. And then with Cherie, his sister-in-law, he felt that he could have done a better job being a brother-in-law, but he felt like they were always surface making, like, because she was a hairdresser and because she works with a lot of gay men in her business, they operated on this sort of superficial level sometimes. And Thomas wondered whether or not he could have been a better brother-in-law, and he was sometimes, but more consistently, because they were too busy seeing each other. Like Thomas didn't want to be mistaken as like conflating his struggles as a white gay man with her struggles as a Black woman in the society. And really what Jake and Cherie were saying to Thomas the whole time was, no, it was through some sort of struggle that we had to actually investigate ourselves and come to find out that we're the same. Mm-hmm. They weren't saying, you're gay and we're addicts, and so we're the same. They were saying, addiction gave us the opportunity to dig deeper into our own humanity, and that's what made us realize that we're all the same. And Thomas never realizes that in the trajectory of the novel.
Well, addiction and recovery, a kind of spiritual coming out in a way. I mean, having to examine yourself in the same sort of rigorous way. I'm going to interrupt this for a second because there is a question. I'm going to now open it up for questions if anyone has a question for Matthew. And this one is from Natasha. Hi, Natasha. It says, yes, I'm interested in the use of time in the novel. Are the passages revealed in snippets drip-fed into the narrative? In some places it works backwards and in some places forwards. Can you comment, Matthew, on the timeline in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I have mixed feelings about MFA programs, and in MFA programs, I think that they can be a great place if you can afford to go and or get a full paid scholarship, and that that they're not sitting there shaking their fingers. But one of the things that's championed in a lot of MFA programs, and Stacey and I didn't have this, we were really encouraged to just take our story wherever they needed to go by most of our wonderful teachers. If anything, we could have used more help with plot and or characterization, but the the in the people sometimes people say that flashbacks, and I have gotten some criticism on the book that I've appreciated and I think is fair, that sometimes the level of detail and the level of flashback slows it down. And all I can say to that is, to me, there is no difference between a present moment and the past, because right here in this moment, right now, as I'm talking, I'm remembering something about the past and I'm thinking about dinner. So those two things get braided together. And so, Natasha, to answer your question, I only wanted the past to come up when he was going to recontextualize it based on his present moment. And the way that it worked in the narrative was so that he could imagine his future, if that makes sense. So to me, it wasn't really flashback or the past. It was the present day realizing something about the past that he had sort of left behind without examining, because of the present day situation was pushing that on him, whether he was in a locker room or whether he was in the car with his brother or whatever was happening. He was remembering college, and he wasn't telling you what he thought he experienced back then. He was saying what he didn't realize back then now.
He was expanding the story,
Oh.
expanding his consciousness. Okay, Katie Hearn has a question. One of my favorite details in the novel is when, in Thomas's confusion about what's happening, he keeps mentally returning to the fact that he was wearing his weekend pants. Anything to share about where this detail comes from? And you might want to give context for those who haven't yet read the book, but who soon will, I trust.
Katie, hi. Katie and I were in a writing group together for years. We were so disciplined. I think we met at like 9 o'clock in the morning, maybe 8 on Fridays. We called ourselves the Steel Magnolias, even though it was a really bad movie, just because we liked the idea of we were all femme and or female identifying at the time, and we were all really dedicated. The rule was you could have small talk after. So anyway, the weekend pants, Michael helped me. I had sex scenes in the book, and I was really interested in how much of a good boy Thomas was. I was really wanting to push on how he dotted every I and crossed every T. And there were sex scenes in the book, and I loved botched sex scenes where people misread each other's cues and then think that they're going to be scoring and then don't. I don't know why I find those excruciating scenes really compelling about humanity. But there's some sex scenes in the book, and Michael, at one point, and I think your exact critique was, I need to see Thomas's cock, if I'm remembering your editorial advice. And I think that when he's in the restroom with the dad in the community and the divider is taken out, in the early drafts, there was a divider, and then he was just like, oh God, it's weird to be in the bathroom with people that think I'm a sex offender. And then I took out the divider, and then that's where I gave Michael what he editorial felt like the novel needed, but it resonated. And also Michael encouraging me to really push on the sex scenes that existed, because it's much easier to hate the country day parents if Thomas was more neutered. And so I wanted him to be wearing these, and also in Portland, I'm not a big crotch gazer. I'm more into chest, arms, faces, teeth, but hands. But in Portland, is there a scratch of underwear? Does anyone have a regular pair of pants? My best friend lives there, and I've been there a million times, and it's just you're just seeing the male anatomy swinging through sweatpants in that city all the time. So I just wanted to put those on Thomas and make it more of a symbol of his virality and sexuality. So it was tougher I wanted Mr. and Mrs. J to have to deal with that reality. So I hope that's a good answer, Katie.
Yes, apparently so. She's indicating. So I don't see any other questions. So I want to ask you about the lab. How did that come into existence? And Can you talk about this this book that you and Alice LaPlante are coming out with next year, which is based on the lab?
Yeah. So the lab started because I work at a university in a two-tier system, and you don't get paid enough to live in the Bay Area when you're a lecturer in creative writing in the California State University. So I was forced to start the lab in order to pay my bills. So, necessity calls. I always want a cashmere sweater and a dentist. So, I'll never forget, I was in my 20s waiting on this woman on the counter, my friend Betsy. She came into the counter all the time at Il Fornaio, and I once touched her in order to indicate that I was going to put her hot plate in front of her. And I said, "Oh my God, that's the softest sweater I've ever felt." And she said, "Once I turned 40, it was cashmere only." And I never forgot that. So I wanted to be able to Antu and I, my husband and I, lived in a studio together for 8 years, in a rent-controlled studio. And I lived in it by myself for a long time before that. And that was the only reason why I could afford to do that job. And still I couldn't travel. So I had summers off, but I didn't have the money to go anywhere. And so I started the lab also because I had kept in touch with a lot of former SFSU students who were like, "When are you going to teach something?" So that's how it started. And then Alice LaPlante and I were colleagues at San Francisco State. I was visiting her in Mallorca, where she relocated after she had a bestseller that was optioned for a movie. And we did a class together, and it went off. We ended up being like really compatible. And so we decided to do a week-long thing that, and she had done, I have it right here actually, The Making of a Story with Norton. And it's a wonderful book. And she had sent out the announcement that we were doing this week-long thing to her mailing list, and her Norton editor was on the list and said, "I can't go." She's also a writer, a poet, our editor. She said, "I can't go, but this sounds like a book. Are you interested?" And because it was COVID and that thing got canceled, we wrote the proposal and sold the book to Norton.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. But the reason I own the lab also is my non-MFA. It's like my non-scholastic. It's like, I don't care about grades. I don't care about assignments. I don't care if you luck. I always say there's 495 requirements to get into the lab, and each one of them is $1. If you have $495, you too are welcome at the lab. And then I meet people like John, who are wonderfully talented, and so many other people. I mean, I'm not kidding. I can't believe some of the people that have come through there who already had several books. But
Wow.
I get it why they do, and it's because it's all generative. I show you somebody else's process, and then I break it down, even visual artists, architects, etc.
You never stop learning if you're a writer, even if you're doing it in utter solitude. I mean, in my 50s, I started writing third person after writing books in first person point of view.
Yep.
It took me 10 years to teach myself how to do that. I should have taken the lab.
Mm-hmm. Well, the fun thing about the lab is that some people that I didn't even know were writers were in it. Maybe I didn't recognize their name, and they didn't differentiate themselves. It's sort of based a little bit on a 12-step model, where it's just like, we don't talk about who we are in the world. And also we don't critique each other. What we do is if we want to, we read up to a 2-minute portion of newly generated work, so everybody's on an even playing field. And then the only way that we really give feedback to one another is, the students read back a line that resonated for them in that person's work. And then I might say something a little bit more about craft, or about read this, or check this out, or have you seen this short story by Mary Gateskill, or have you read, Brandon Taylor's novel? If that story, if it seems to me there might be a key inside of it that might help unlock something for the person.
So you mentioned earlier that you're 51.
Mm-hmm.
You've published your first novel, and you have this book from Norton coming out. How does it feel?
It feels great. I also moved during COVID, and
To a beautiful condo.
Thanks. My people that come to visit my apartment are like, "Oh, what's it like to have like a, whatever the amenity might be?" And I'm like, "Oh, I adjust to luxury instantly." It takes me no time whatsoever to step into. I waited a long time to have a book. I came close to having a book with 3 different manuscripts. The next book I'm planning on sending out on Friday. as in the day after tomorrow, it'll probably more realistically be Monday. But and you and I have talked about the details about that particular novel and what our plan is. But yeah, I wrote the entire time. The thing about growing up queer the way that I did, and I'm a survivor and I'm a fighter and I'm a worker, is that I did not let the mainstream publishing industry tell me who I am. I remember what Jan and Chuck and Richard and June and my Steel Magnolias writing group and Stacy, my other friends that I met at San Francisco State, the ways in which they encouraged me and saw a kernel of something worthwhile in me. That's really what I focused on. Not that I did not have some very, very dark days, but I was given one gift in this life that keeps me from being completely petty at all times. And that is, I am genuinely happy for other people's success, even in areas that I don't have it. So thank God, because so many of my students had books for years before me. So it feels good to, now I do interviews. Now they interview me because they can elevate my status by being associated with them, which is an amazing feeling. The best feeling I've ever gotten really is seeing students publish. The feeling of publishing myself has been great, but the best feeling I've ever gotten is seeing students succeed.
Well, I have to say, I've published 10 novels, and publishing you and Monique and Casey and Joe, it's the most fulfilling thing I've ever done as a writer.
You're my mom. You're a mama. You're a daddy. I believe you, and I felt that from you, and I feel like I talk to my students all the time about the pros and cons of indie small press versus mainstream, since I now have both contracts. And there are positive and negatives to anything. And I always say I couldn't bring you out to sushi on what I got for my advance for Doubting Thomas. But
you got an advance.
I got a second. What did you say?
You got an advance, which is more than some
right.
of our other writers got.
Yeah, that's true. But I wasn't looking for that, and like I knew that when you said that Thomas could be queerer and angrier, that I was just like, oh, okay. There's, and I also saw what I am. I do have a very pronounced inner lesbian. And so the thought of being one of the first books, because it was Alan's book before mine, before you came on,
Right.
but to be one of the first books that at a historically lesbian press, it just felt like, do I need another signal from the universe that this is the place for me? So I could not be happier. That joy that you have for us really comes through, and it was like getting a second MFA. You said to me, "Oh, I would take it as is." There's just a few things, but I felt like you had read it so carefully that I really wanted to deliver on them, and it took me quite some time.
Well, it's a wonderful book, and you deserve every iota of success that it brings you. And so thank you again, Kevin, Anissa, and the San Francisco Public Library.
Thank you, San Francisco Public Library. May I just say one last thing to Kevin and Anissa, and that is that Doubting Thomas was partially written in the Golden Gate branch on Green Street in San Francisco because my Wi-Fi was going out all the time, and I wanted to stay married. And my husband and I lived in a studio, so sometimes I would go down the street to that library and work for hours on Doubting Thomas. So I love the library. I love the friends of the library. Thank you so much for carrying our books. And Thank you so much for having us tonight.
Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for that great conversation. Thanks to the lovely audience for being here. So we'll see you next time. Have a great night.
Thanks, everybody, for